Welcome into 5 Wide Fantasy today, jumping into my running back rankings, heading into week 16 of the fantasy football season, the semifinals. I hope for a lot of you, if it is not the semifinals of your league, you need to fix your league settings. Do not let anyone do this to you when it comes to fantasy football. But we'll be jumping into the top 30 I have at the position, going through basically every matchup here. All of guys you need to be starting, and then as well, guys at the end you need to be sitting, and obviously those flex options as well. If you guys enjoyed today's video, if you're getting value from some of this information, hit that like button for me and subscribe to the channel as well if you're new. Let's jump into these rankings. Our number one guy in the week, no shocker, Christian McCaffrey, a matchup with Baltimore, which is a tough one, but no reason to think any other week that we've seen from Christian McCaffrey. Third in fantasy points allowed are the Ravens, so good unit, very competitive game here. I'm super, super excited for this one on Christmas night. 2, Kyren Williams from the LA Rams has had a terrific finish to the year here since he's come back from his injury. New Orleans, not a great matchup, top 10 in fantasy points allowed, but they are 21st in EPA against the run. This isn't a terrific unit. The Saints are not the same defense they've been of old. They're still a pretty solid unit, but nothing to be too concerned about for Williams, who gets great volume, gets a great amount of touchdown opportunities, and just has one of the best roles in football right now. 3, Alvin Kamara. Kamara coming off a pretty decent week. Didn't find the end zone, didn't rush the ball super effectively, but did have like 5 receptions, over 40 receiving yards. Really elevates his floor, makes him a very safe play every week. Los Angeles, though, 4th in fantasy points allowed to running backs on the season, 11th in run defense grade from PFF as well. So not necessarily a fantastic matchup, but honestly, there's a lot of players here that have either had poor performances or don't have great matchups either. Kamara is someone that is very secure, very safe for you. 4, Raheem Mostert. Got to get an elevation from me. Getting the Dallas defense, who just got torched by James Cook last week. Now, don't necessarily think it'll be the same here, but Dallas is now 15th in fantasy points allowed, 11th in EPA against the run. Mostert leads the league in touchdowns. No, it's not Christian McCaffrey. It's actually Raheem Mostert. Would expect him to find the end zone again in this game, which should see a lot of points and a lot of opportunities for Mostert to produce. 5, Travis Etienne. Not a great matchup against Tampa Bay. They're 8th in fantasy points allowed. A pretty solid run front, but can give up some opportunities in the passing game for running backs. And when you look at the Jaguars missing Christian Kirk and now missing Zay Jones, Etienne's role might grow there as well, but we know he's secured as a locked and loaded workhorse back for this team. 6, Isaiah Pacheco. Team said early this week that he is going to be available and will be ready to play this week against the Raiders. The Raiders present an excellent matchup. They're 22nd in fantasy points allowed to running backs, and what are they? 16th in EPA against the run, so more of a middling group, but we know Pacheco in that lead role for this offense is in an excellent spot here to produce, and the Raiders provide a great script here for him to see plenty of touches as well. 7, Joe Mixon. Mixon coming off of a really difficult matchup against the Vikings defense, gets a much softer one here in the Steelers, who Trey Sermon, Tyler Goodson ran the ball at will in the second half against the Steelers front. Mixon has the opportunity to find some success here behind this Bengals offensive line. Steelers are 24th in fantasy points allowed to running backs on the season. 8, Rachaad White. White continues to be a workhorse, much like Travis Etienne, gets the Jacksonville defense, who's given up the most receptions per game to running backs, over 7 receptions a game to the position. So White should have great opportunity to produce there and elevate his floor on the week. Jacksonville fallen down a little bit in rankings when it comes to fantasy points allowed to the position. They're 12th. Still a pretty good run front, I think, but have not been as good as they were early in the season. 9, James Cook. I really hope this performance from Cook elevates his role a little bit to being on the field a little bit more when the team gets inside the 10-yard line to convert more touchdown opportunities. The Chargers, though, going to provide a great script. The Chargers like an 11-point dog in this game. The Bills should be in a really good game script for Cook to get the ball quite a bit, much like we saw this past week against Dallas as well. On the season, the Chargers 21st in fantasy points allowed, 24th in EPA against the run. 10, Kenneth Walker. Almost feel like this might even be a little bit disrespectful. Maybe I should have Walker higher than this. Tennessee has not been the run front that they've been of seasons past. We saw some success this past week from, who did they have? The Texans. We saw Devin Singletary run really, really well. So Walker had a tough matchup with the Eagles, found ways to be successful and looked really, really good in that game. Walker is one of the best backs in the league, in my opinion. But Tennessee, 18th in fantasy points allowed, but are 7th in EPA against the run. So it is a decent front, not as elite as it's been in seasons past. But with the Titans, and their struggles offensively, it leads to teams being able to, lean on the run game a little bit more with some leads. 11, Saquon Barkley. Look, I've said all year that the Eagles are a good run defense. I'm not completely sold on it at this point in the season. I don't think they've gotten nearly enough. They're also a little bit banged up with Zach Cunningham missing last week as well. We'll see what his status is like. And Barkley is very much the focal point of this offense. But again, the Eagles are first in fantasy points allowed to running backs. The Giants do need to stay in this game in order for Barkley to contribute in a big way on the ground. But we know he's going to be able to stay on the fields and find ways to be productive, even in trailing game scripts as a pass catcher too. Rounding out the top 12, Breece Hall. Hall has not run the ball effectively whatsoever the last 6 weeks, but the passing game has always been an involvement for him regardless of the opponent. It's a huge, huge opportunity here getting Washington's defense where I think he can run the ball more effectively. Washington is now 27th in fantasy points allowed to running backs on the season and 26th in EPA. So a great opportunity for Hall to give you a top 12 week when you need it most. Okay, now we move to our RB2s, starting with Jahmyr Gibbs. The Lions get a tough matchup for their running game in the Minnesota Vikings. The Vikings are second right now in fantasy points allowed to running backs. Brian Flores, a team coached by him defensively, continues and pretty much year in and year out is one of the better run defenses in the league. Like to stack the box, blitz quite a bit, so that leads to these running backs having a little bit more of a tougher time getting to the second level. That'll be the case here for this Detroit Lions offense. Gibbs is still going to be a solid play for you because he's going to be involved in the receiving game, and he's also getting more opportunities to score touchdowns as we saw last week. So that makes me feel good about Gibbs in terms of having a high enough floor that even in a bad matchup, I'm going to feel confident playing him. 14, Derrick Henry. Henry did not look good at all. You saw him talking a little bit about his future, potentially not being a Titan next season, but we get a better matchup here against Seattle, so I do feel comfortable going back to him because I still see him as the lead back for this offense. Seattle is 28th in fantasy points allowed to running backs on the season, 25th in EPA against the run as well, so a good chance for Henry to bounce back after a brutal stat line last week against Houston. 15, Bijan Robinson. I know, his role was completely ceded to Tyler Algier. Bijan was another guy that really struggled efficiency-wise last week against Carolina, which was surprising because Carolina's been one of the worst run defenses in the league. I don't think, we've seen this before where Algier's gotten the lion's share of work the one week and then it goes back to Bijan. I'm willing to trust that Bijan will still get the ball back in this game as the lead back. We know his capabilities as a pass catcher as well. Matchup's pretty solid. Indianapolis, 29th in fantasy points allowed to running backs. I think he could bounce back here this week. I'm just not quite as high on him where he's more consistently been a top 12 guy for me. He's now in that RB2 range just with a little bit of skepticism. 16, Ezekiel Elliott has one of the best matchups in fantasy football. He needs to be in your starting lineup this week against the Broncos. The Broncos, for my money, are the worst run defense in the entire league. Second worst, though, in fantasy points allowed to running backs. Dead last, though, in EPA against the run. So love the matchup here as the workhorse in this Patriots offense. 17, Tony Pollard. Tony Pollard is going to be the reason I don't win fantasy championships. He's in 2 of my 3 leagues that I'm in the semifinal for. I'm managing to do it despite him, not because of him. It would be great if we could get some decent weeks from Pollard, who gets all the valuable opportunities you want to see. But Miami, been pretty solid defensively this season, 11th in fantasy points allowed to running backs. 15th? Yeah, 15th in EPA against the run, 2nd in run defense grade from PFF. So not necessarily a great matchup, competitive matchup here. We'll still see Pollard involved, getting enough opportunities, but the matchup isn't great in that, he's now more of a middle of the pack RB2 for me. 18, Jonathan Taylor. I do think Taylor will be back for this game. Don't think Zach Moss will be available. So I'm going to plug this in as if Taylor is available. If we're going to a Trey Sermon or a Tyler Goodson, who I didn't talk about in the waiver wire video for good reason, don't really think they're playable in this game. Atlanta's a really good run defense, 6th in fantasy points allowed, 4th in EPA against the run. So tough matchup, but for Taylor being the workhorse in this offense, he's still definitely playable for you as an RB2. 19, Chuba Hubbard. Feeling really good about Hubbard. Hubbard's another one of the guys like Zeke that kind of goes under the radar, but to me is a must-start guy against Green Bay. 25th in fantasy points allowed to the position, 20th in EPA against the run. Panthers as well at home in this game. That should definitely help, and this is a team wanting to lean more on their ground attack at this point in the season with Bryce Young's struggles as well. 20, Josh Jacobs. I think Jacobs will be available for this game. I would be surprised if he isn't, but you never know. So I'm kind of a little bit more hesitant here of his potential. If White plays, White would be probably somebody like maybe 4 or 5 spots back in these rankings. Kansas City, 14th in fantasy points allowed, but 27th in EPA. The matchup isn't bad. It's just about the fact that the Raiders are sizable dogs in this game. Do we have the right game script? Can we score? Because Kansas City, as much as we've seen these numbers, aren't great against the run. Overall, as a defense, not giving up a lot of points either. 21, James Conner. Conner gets a matchup with the Bears. That's definitely one that's pretty positive for him in terms of, the Bears offense not lighting teams up. This is a game that the Cardinals could potentially win. But against the run, the Bears are a good unit. They're 3rd in EPA against the run this season. Is a good run defense. Is just going to be about whether or not we get the proper script that Conner can get the ball a good amount here. But he's found ways to be effective in some of the most difficult matchups, so definitely still feel confident starting him here. 22, Aaron Jones gets Carolina. Carolina has vastly improved their run defense over the last probably, honestly, just the second half of the year. Like, they were really, really bad to start the season. This point of the year, they're not quite as bad of a unit as some of these numbers indicate, where they're 30th in fantasy points allowed to running backs, but they've jumped now into 14th in EPA against the run. So I think they're doing enough here to be a little bit more respected, where I don't have Jones as like a slam dunk play this week, but still top 24 guy that you definitely should be starting. 23, Devon Achane. Again, seeing Mostert take advantage of the touchdown opportunities. I think Achane will still give you enough fantasy value in this matchup to be able to play him against Dallas's defense. Like I said, Dallas is more of a mediocre group against the run so far this season. Now, after that big game they gave up to James Cook. So Achane's still startable, still serviceable, but just not as much upside with Mostert stealing those touchdowns. 24, Javonte Williams. New England's defense, tough to run on. They're 13th in fantasy points allowed, and which is really impressive when you consider the fact that they're one of the worst teams in the league, one of the worst offenses in the league. So traditionally, you're going to be in game scripts where your backs are going to get the ball, but they're the number 1 team in EPA against the run. So it's not necessarily a great matchup for Williams in their rushing offense. That's why I think New England will be a team that, honestly, on what is this game on? Is this Christmas Eve night? Yeah, could be a live dog in this game, especially when we saw the Lions take away the run from the Broncos. Take away the run from the Broncos. It was very tough for them to move the ball effectively. All right, now we go to some flex options, some guys inside of my top 30 this week. Look, there's a ton of players and options for you in weeks without buys that make a lot of these guys you can find reasons to start. So we'll go through things here. 25 is Najee Harris. I still feel pretty solid about starting Harris here. The Bengals, 20th in fantasy points allowed, 30th in EPA against the run. Harris is going to be the guy getting the majority of the rushing opportunities, a little bit less in the passing game. Can take advantage of that here. I kind of like Pittsburgh in this game at home. Think that Harris could bounce back after a tough week. This is a pretty solid matchup for him. 26, David Montgomery. Look, when you go into a matchup with Minnesota like we talked about, that's tough to run the ball, and Montgomery's role is pretty much dead set on just the rushing opportunities. I'm a little bit worried about playing him, especially now with Gibbs taking away those touchdown scores. In a game that they scored 40-plus points, Montgomery wasn't able to find the end zone, so that gives me a little bit of pause, making him more of a flex option than a slam dunk start for you this week. 27, DeAndre Swift. Look, DeAndre Swift, they say people have a nose for the end zone. I don't know what to call what DeAndre Swift is doing this season. He just refuses to score. Had opportunities to do it against Seattle on Monday night. Didn't do it. Fell short, I think, on a couple of runs at like the 1-yard line. And we see Jalen Hurts sneak the ball in. The Giants, though, are a good matchup. 26th in fantasy points allowed to the position. But again, Gainwell's getting on the field a little bit, stealing some of the receiving work. Swift isn't running the ball super effectively. Like, I just can't feel super confident in it. It's a great matchup. If you start him, I don't think you're silly to do so, but the ceiling just isn't there because he's not scoring. 28, Gus Edwards. Speaking of guys that have potential ceilings, Edwards is that type of player. He can find the end zone a couple of times and win you a week, but he can also burn you. The floor is super, super low for Edwards. A very risky start. San Francisco, competitive matchup, very good run defense. 7th in fantasy points allowed, 2 running backs on the season. So it's a risky play, but a game here where you could see both of these offenses be the ones to find success over the defenses. So Edwards, and now without Keaton Mitchell, is going to see a little bit of a bump here in opportunities too, which is, for me, is enough to make him a top 30 guy. 29, Devin Singletary. Singletary here, I think, a little bit more, how would I describe this? He's definitely asserted himself into the number one role and kind of leaving Dameon Pierce a little bit of the dust now, which is a good sign, especially for just fantasy managers looking to play him. You can have a little bit more assurance of his volume. But Cleveland, no joke in terms of matchup. Second in EPA against the run. That results in them being the 9th best defense in fantasy points allowed to running backs on the season. So it's not a matchup I'm super excited about. But now that the volume's there, elevates his floor and makes you feel a little bit more comfortable playing him. Rounding out the top 30, Tyler Algier. I've got to include him because the matchup against Indy is so good, but I still have pause as to whether or not he's going to get the same amount of opportunities he got last week. It's just so unpredictable, but based on what we saw last week, I've got to still give the matchup, when I consider the matchup and then I consider the potential of this matchup for Algier of potentially being the top option on the ground, it does make you... It does make me consider playing him and make him just enough of a consideration in that top 30 as well. All right, some players that have missed out and we do need to touch on because you're going to be wondering where Austin Eckler is. He's my RB33 on the week. Look, too much of a guessing game. He's killed you for too many weeks. Obviously, a sizable underdog in this game against the Bills as well. Cannot risk it. I just can't. Jerome Ford's my RB31. I could see you wanting to play him, but Houston has really started to prove themselves as a pretty solid run defense. With D'Amico Ryans, the head coach who came from San Francisco in the offseason, brought in the same scheme, and this scheme is just finding ways to stop the run, like we saw against Derrick Henry last week. Ty Chandler getting Detroit a top 5 fantasy defense to running backs. If he still has the role to himself, it's intriguing, but the matchup's just too tough. Even if Alexander Madison is back, I wouldn't play either one of these guys. Deonta Foreman gave me a little bit of curiosity just because of a good matchup, but they're really splitting the touches between him, Roschon, and Herbert, and I think Foreman had 6 carries for like -6 yards, so it's tough to feel confident even in the good matchup. And Jaylen Warren's my RB36 on the week. Matchup's pretty solid. Role is kind of deteriorating, so a little bit of a question mark there. A.J. Dillon also RB35 if he does play this week too. Anybody I missed or anybody you want to hear more about or any considerations you're trying to make to start or sit in your fantasy lineup, happy to answer those questions down below. But if you have questions about running backs, I would just go by the rankings. Those would be my answers. Unless I didn't mention them, then I'm happy to answer those ones. But running back, receiver, questions there, drop those down below in the comment section. Again, guys, if you enjoyed today's video, I'd really, really appreciate it if you did hit the like button for me. Thank you guys so much for watching, and we'll see you on the next one.